We'll move to the next work, which is from Matthew Sumpter and Tempest Neal, User Perception of Article Credibility Warnings Towards Understanding the Influence of Journalists and AI Agents. So I think Matthew will present, so Matthew, you can share your screen, I guess.
Sure, so I'll pull it up now. I imagine I am sharing successfully now, so let's pop
Yes.
it up. And it looks like you can all see yourselves. Let's pull you away. All right. So, hi, my name is Matt Sumpter. I'm a PhD student at the University of South Florida. I'm going to be presenting some work that me and Dr. Tempest Neal did. Thank you to all the presenters and organizers. And I have a tendency to talk a lot, so I'm going to get right into it to preserve some time. A quick roadmap so you guys know what to expect. Fairly typical. I'm going to set up some motivation. This was a study that essentially was performed as a survey. We're going to discuss those results and some conclusions that came thereafter. So the motivation here is that looking at how to mitigate information, the kind of foremost and most successful suggestion on how to do this is through pre-exposure warnings, where we are able to get a warning about, questionable credibility in front of a user before they ever actually view the misinformation. Now, this is certainly a difficult thing to do if you're relying on human fact checkers. So for many reasons, there's been a lot of work done for computational fact checking, which is perhaps the best way that you could actually analyze this work and get these warnings in front of a user before they view misinformation. Now, having said that, there's been relatively little work done to see how effective these solutions are, with the exception at the time of writing this paper. The only work that I could find was from our previous speaker, Dr. Horn, regarding the idea. And what he found is that, and he can correct me if I'm misrepresenting, what he found is that essentially AI does improve user assessment when feature-based explanations are present, with some nuances based on media consumption and news behavior and stuff like that. So the motivation here was to kind of build upon that work and see what other questions or nuances may affect this, as well as consider the fact that if we're seeking to replace in some way human journalists, how well does the AI stack up in comparison to those human journalists? And then also look at other nuances. And if I may, I also found in writing this paper, parts at times it felt like a position piece, because there's so much work being done to create these models, and most successful models are a lot of time deep learning models that are not very explainable. And when we have these not very explainable models, whereas we have research showing that the explainability is important to make them effective, it brings the question of how do we actually guide this research in a way that is going to be effective in the long run. So off the soapbox, getting into it, this was in the form of a survey. So we started with essentially general demographic questions, political leanings, media consumption habits, to get an idea of the audience we were looking at and know what kind of trends we might pick up on. And then as well, look at the kind of how the audience self-assess their understanding of AI. How knowledgeable are they about it, and how effective do they think it is at solving problems? So we asked these sorts of questions, and then getting kind of into the meat of the survey, we picked, this was an article assessment survey. So we picked 6 politically themed articles. 3 of these were true, verifiably, and 3 were made up by volunteers, so they were verifiably false. And each participant was randomly assigned 4 articles. So these 4 articles had one of these 3 warnings. The top 2 are most notable in the sense that they would either see an AI judgment with some level of confidence, or a journalist judgment. And these could be credible or non-credible for both journalist and AI. And then finally, they may have also seen the additional no information available. These acted as kind of a control group on those same articles. So they had no treatment and no pre-exposure warning. And from this, they were asked to rate the credibility on a 7-point scale of how credible they thought this article was. A couple nuances to this: these judgments by AI and journalists were fake. They were just made for the purpose of the study. We don't have AI performing these analyses. And additionally, in 2 cases, the AI and the journalists were actually misleading. They were incorrect. And this will come up later, and I'll show the effects of that. So this is an example of a view that a user might have seen when going through the survey. So it's got the judgment at the top, a short snippet of an article. And with our 6 articles and 3 possible pre-exposure warnings, this led to a possible 18 views that a user might have come across while viewing this, taking this survey. So our results. So we had 204 participants, so that came out to about 35 participants per view. It is notable, so we polled our survey participants from university newsletters and postings, as well as online survey boards and things like that. We certainly have a liberal leaning and a younger audience and skew to this data, so keep that in mind, and that's certainly something to consider as we look at these results. Now, to get into the meat of the survey, I'm going to pull up a laser pointer because this is a relatively heavy-duty visualization, so I want to break it down for you. So along the top here, we have our first 3 articles, which were all true articles. And along the bottom are the 3 false articles. And the way this is set up, these are the group that have the AI treatment, the journalist treatment, and the control group. And in both cases, the larger the bar, the more correct the users were. So on the bottom, if the larger the bar, the more likely they were to guess that the article was false or not credible. And on the top, the larger they are, the more likely they were to believe it was true. So at first, just kind of a visual analysis, we see that AI and journalists do seem to be performing relatively similarly in all cases. But we did perform some statistical analysis. So one way ANOVA test to see where this was statistically significant. We do see that on 2, 3, and 5. So I'm going to focus on those moving forward. And notably, first of all, on number 2, this is one of the misleading cases. So for both the AI and journalist treatment, they were told, there's a suggestion that these might be not credible articles. And what we see is that there's a significant decrease from the control group. These had an influence on users. And this is perhaps important just to emphasize that if we're going to be creating these tools, it is certainly important that they are accurate and not making mistakes, because you could have these unfortunate side effects of doing so. In other cases, we see that here, both cases, AI and journalists, perceptions improved upon the control group, and then down here, surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, AI, for a reason that I'm not necessarily set up to explain, the AI performed much better than the journalist. So there's some suggestion that in some cases it may actually perform better. Now, some additional interest, we wanted to know why maybe 2, 3, and 5 were so successful, whereas 1, 4, and 6, there was no strong difference. So we performed some sentiment analysis of these articles. And looking at the absolute value of these scores, we saw that the more sentimental the language, the less likely these pre-exposure warnings were to have an influence on the audience. And then alternatively, the less sentimental, the more likely it was that these exposure warnings had a difference. So again, an interesting consideration considering where these may be effective and where they may not be. Another interesting question that we're asking and looking for is how much does a user's perception of AI influence the effectiveness of these tools? So we see here that essentially this is how effective a user perceived AI to be, and on the y-axis, essentially how knowledgeable they rated themselves to be on this. And we can see some sort of trend downwards. The less knowledgeable they believed themselves to be, the more likely they were to not really find AI to be that effective. There is certainly a case, I'm not going to necessarily comment on the psychology of this, but because these were self-ratings, it'd be interesting if there was some sort of Dunning-Kruger effect. The more confident they are in the technology, the more likely they are to just believe it and pull into it. But again, not my place to comment. And then, so the more effective they thought it was, we also find that then the more likely they were to agree with the assessment. So this is a relatively expected trend. They think a user thinks they know a lot about AI, so they believe it to be more effective, and then we see them agreeing with the AI more as a consequence of that. And so this all kind of leads to the set of final conclusions here that, first of all, we did see AI may be as effective as influencing users' perceptions of credibility as a journalist. That's kind of the important distinction here. And in some cases we saw more effective. And there are certainly a lot of work to be done to know the nuances of why and when one may be more effective than the other in the cases where these are effective. So one of these nuances we noticed is that sentiment reduces the effectiveness of these pre-exposure warnings in our study. And additionally, there's a case perhaps to be made about educating the public about AI to help increase the effectiveness of these solutions. The more they know, the more they can kind of come into these warnings with some level of understanding of them. So I'm watching my timer here at the top. It looks like I'm about out, but I think I reached the end. So thank you so much for listening, and any questions, I welcome them. Thank you.